Welcome back, guys. It's Creature Pie, and we're going back through general principles to obey in SJT. So if you're with me on the iPad, hopefully you should be. Now, one of the first points is that you check the role of the individual. For example, a medical student won't be able to administer drugs. So any scenario in which requires or says that the medical student should administer drugs would be a complete, very inappropriate statement. We know that by fact because one, he doesn't have the experience, and two, it's just not befitting for his job role. With many other scenarios, you have to check the role of the individual. This is very, very important. Now, point number two is that medical professionalism and patient safety are very, very tantamount and very, very important. Now, it says that you should always be careful of unprofessional conduct. Now, this may be, for example, a doctor drinking outside his job and now attacking, insulting patients that he actually treats. So it affects the public perception of doctors, and hence anything that does do so intentionally be very, very inappropriate. Now, point number three is that the seniority of someone's position isn't important at all in cases where a mistake has been made. This seems quite obvious, but sometimes you might feel like, for example, a medical student trying to correct a consultant whereby the consultant is clearly wrong is something inappropriate to do. No, it's not. It would be very, very inappropriate, because do remember that patient safety and public concern is something that supersedes any honor of any consultant, because at the end of the day, they're there to save lives, and if they are doing the opposite, that thing that honored them would be used to de-honor them or demote them, or whatever you want to call it. Now, the fourth point is that any illegal behavior is not acceptable and is an automatic D. Now, in the UK, we cannot do any illegal actions as a doctor. In the UK, euthanasia is wrong and is against the law. So even if a patient was to ask and they really, really wanted it and they were Gilead competent, it's something you cannot do. So any scenario that mentions euthanasia or mentions a procedure that is not permissible in the UK would be an automatic D, just setting the guidelines. Now, point number five is that if you hear slanders and backbiting in the workplace, one, it's unacceptable but shouldn't be taken into account when deciding on how to respond, as it's not a reliable source of information. Now, the last thing you want, especially as a doctor, is to blame members of your team for something that you're not sure of. Yes, backbiting and slandering is wrong, but to take action upon something you are unsure of would be an automatic D, which would be a very inappropriate statement. This is because anything that affects team morale will affect patient safety later on. For example, in a team, if a cardiologist and a nurse are not getting on well with each other, it could mean that the lack of communication could affect patient safety. So we're trying essentially to prevent anything that could cause harm, and anything that does cause harm would be an automatic D. Now, point number five is that one should act with urgency when it comes to matters of patient safety. For example, if you find out that one of your colleagues is drunk and he's working on shift as a doctor, you do your utmost to stop this and remove him from the workplace by contacting the supervisors, obviously, not trying to physically attack him or anything like that. It doesn't matter whether you're not on duty, it's your obligation to look after the public, whether on or off duty, and that links back to the second point, I believe. So that's another thing to consider. Now, one point that I've mentioned here is that solve the problems in your house before you fight a war. Now, one thing you do is ensure that your team are performing the best before trying to help other teams, because there are other consultants and other members of your team who are more than capable of ensuring improvement in that sector. So again, fight the war inside your house before you go outside and try to do everything. Now, tip number 6, 7 or 8, I don't know, is advise locally before you escalate. Now, it seems quite basic, but sometimes people will be like, I just don't want to get involved and I'm just going to bring it straight to the supervisor. That would probably be something that's inappropriate but not awful. The reason why this may be the case is because simply the patient or the person or the team member may have forgotten, and you don't want to escalate and bring someone else involved if it was a mistake. Also, it could be the case that your peers don't know or your team members don't know, for example, if they smell of alcohol, which may affect the doctor-patient interaction. Now, the 8th point, not attending a meeting without justification will always be inappropriate, except when it's the case when you are threatening patient safety, in which would be undoubtedly awful. Now, yes, you may assume that it's probably awful no matter what the case is, but at the very least they are informing the team of what will be taking place, so it's not awful in that regard. However, when it's the case that it is threatening patient safety, now patient safety again supersedes anything, and when something is harming patient safety, what happens is that it straight away just becomes an awful thing to do. Now what you can see with the gist of these principles is that you have to assess the consequences before you're able to jump to a conclusion and say it's awful or say it's very appropriate. That's why I mention here, in order to effectively answer the question, you must understand the consequences. Now, one of the points on here is that it's always important to be a comforting source no matter who is correct in the argument. Now, it could be the case that the patient is incorrect, but what you will ensure is that the patient believes that the doctors are there for the benefit of the patient. Again, that seems a lot of wishy-washy rubbish, but it is the case, and you're trying to ensure that the patients come to you for the diagnosis, for treatment, instead of staying at home and worsening their own condition. Now, tip number 10 probably, it says you are never allowed to lie in any scenario whatsoever. Let's just stop it out there. Yes, sometimes you may want to lie. For example, if you're a medical student and you've been told about the diagnosis of the patient and the patient says, "Can I know?" and you're like, "No, I have to wait for the doctor," and he says, "Do you know?" You are not allowed to lie. You just cannot lie. You have to say, "I'm not allowed to tell you that information." You can't say no, even though it probably saves you a lot of hassle. It's just a part of the GMC guidelines, and especially for this Ucat exam, you cannot lie whatsoever. If you do lie, it's automatically an awful thing to do. I'm telling you right now, if there's a lie involved, it's a ridiculous thing, and straight away give it something that's awful. But the reasoning behind this, probably to be more concise, is that due to the fact that it can damage public confidence in medical staff. If the patient is to find out that you are lying, it could be the case that they believe if you're able to lie in this matter, you're able to lie in their treatment. And when that happens, it affects public perception of doctors and the NHS, and straight away is something that's awful. So that's probably the reasoning behind it, and I hope that makes sense. If you have very minimal time, I have an ebook that is present in the link description, and that's my killer tips. Essentially, I explained them in the video, but there are some tips in there that I haven't really explained. Basically, catch you guys on the other side.
Why is it hard for me? Why is it hard for me? Oh.